Hey everyone, this is Magical Hacker, and welcome to episode number 1 of the Eminence Podcast, where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills, and I help you on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by DMany and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker, and today's topic, chosen by DMany, is the question, do I need 6 mana in Commander? It's kind of a weird title, but I really like this idea, and I think DMany's really onto something here. It might be something that I've been kind of feeling for a while, but, maybe DMany's actually talking about this in a more clear way than I can. And in fact, when DMany presented this topic for the podcast today, he also sent me a blog post where he goes really in depth in this. So if you want to take a look at the full blog post over at aminoapps.com, I've put a link in it, a link to that blog in the description wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Spotify, wherever you're listening to this podcast, you can find that link to that blog post in its entirety down there in the description. So a couple of quotes there from this blog post that I think will kind of overall summarize the idea. DMany says, how much mana is the minimum I need to make impactful plays and or just function to the point where you don't fall behind because you haven't found lands? And later on, he says, what I've noticed in deck building is that the better and more powerful the deck I build, the less overall mana I need to be able to just play a game and impact the board every turn. I really like this later on where he says this. Let's give an example. I have an Underworld Breach and a Mana Geyser in hand and a big X damage spell in the yard. So cast the Geyser, get some absurd amount of mana, and then play the Breach and do mana, right? You may say, well, to do the play, you obviously needed more than 6 to 7 mana, which you would be correct to assume, but the X spell was the finisher play. Later on, he says this. Let's go simpler. A more typical play would be 4 mana Wrath, then play a 2 or 3 mana play. You impacted the game and got some advantage. It doesn't seem like much, but it could be a setup play. So I like the way that DMany presents this, and like I said, the full blog post is down in the description. But the idea is, what's the minimum amount of mana that you'll need in order to cast 2 or 3 spells that will combine together to really set you far up ahead? So I like the great example of the Wrath, where you're going for a board wipe, you're wiping away the board, and then rather than passing the turn to the opponent after you so that they can be the first ones to rebuild, and again, that would mean the first ones to take advantage of the board being empty, then instead you can be the first one, right? So you wipe away the board, and then you go ahead and start doing things. This is interesting when you consider the podcast released by Command Zone. Oh, and it must have been at least a couple of years by now, where they talked about going first in a game of Commander is by far one of the best things that you can do if you want to win well, which kind of, unfortunately, it's not that great because you can't control that, right? That's the part that's random. But this part you can control. So if you're looking at your deck and saying, okay, if I'm going to want to cast 2 spells in a turn, what do I want to do? And I think part of that also means you have to take a look at your average CMC or your average mana value of the deck. So, depending on where you're at, it might be somewhere in the 2.5 range, or it might be all the way up to 4, just kind of depending on your style of building. And when I was looking at my decks, I have kind of a big spread, but that's pretty much where I've been. I've been kind of in the 3 to 4 range. In some decks, depending on what I'm trying to do, they're above 4, but typically it's in that 3 to 4 range. So if I wanted to do 2 spells in a turn, I would probably need about 7 mana. And then when I took a look at that, I realized, this actually lines up really well with the way that I build my decks. So if you're brand new to the channel, or you haven't heard me talking on Twitter before, or on YouTube before, and you're not really sure, who's this magical hacker guy? What's so special about him? Well, first of all, I'm not that special. I'm just a regular player like you. And over this past decade of playing Commander, I've kind of chiseled my way into a unique style of building decks and playing decks that I found is very successful, and it's very different than what most people do. And as you listen to this podcast, you'll get more information about what that's like. But for right now, let me summarize part of it by talking about how I typically approach ramp. And then you'll see the connection here to the Commander theory of only 6 mana needed. So for a long time, when I first started playing Commander, I think we all start here. why do I need ramp? I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm just playing a deck. I'm not trying to play super expensive spells. I don't need ramp. So I started off saying no ramp at all. And of course, I got steamrolled by my opponents all the time. They were doing multiple things per turn and I wasn't. And so then I realized, okay, I see the point of ramp. Even if you're not doing big things, it helps you do more things. And so doing more things means you're playing the game more. And if you think of it like in terms of the number of turns that you're having, instead of taking 8 turns before the game is over, maybe you're taking 12 turns, right? And so you're taking a turn and a half every round cycle because during your turn, you're drawing more cards. You have more mana. So you're playing more spells per turn than you would be if you weren't, drawing cards and ramping. Okay, so I said, okay, I definitely want the ramp. And so I started off adding signets, rampant growth, nature's lore, all those good things. Those cards that everybody loves, and this was before Arcane Signet, but you can toss Arcane Signet into there too, right? I'm playing all these 2 mana rocks and ramp spells that give me net 1 mana, and here's what I found. It really limited me. I could not even play like a 6 mana commander or higher because I would cast it, something would happen, a board wipe would happen, it would get destroyed. I would maybe play it a second time, maybe, let's say it gets countered, and then that's it. There's no way I'd be able to play my commander a third time. And even if I wasn't playing my commander, I was really limited. I find myself with very few cards in hand, even with all the card draw, and I have maybe 3 or 4 rocks on the battlefield, but still not enough mana to do stuff if I had enough cards in hand. And so I took a step back and I thought about it like this. If I could play a divination in one of my decks, would I do it? And really, I don't think I would. It's 3 mana, draw 2, it's a sorcery, and it's really not all that great. However, if I were thinking about something, just drawing 1 more card, and I guess a great example of this is Harmonize. 4 mana, draw 3 cards. Is it worth paying that 1 extra mana to draw 1 additional card? And to me, that was the big kind of the light bulb moment where I realized, you know what? In Commander, we want to do plays, but those plays have to be big enough. If it's not big enough, then it's not good enough. And so that was where I decided maybe I should try looking at ramp. That's not just giving me 1 mana, like a rampant growth, but maybe 2 mana or more. So I'm talking about stuff like Skyshroud's Claim. Hedron Archive didn't exist at the time, but that would be another example. Maybe Urgolem's Eye or Sisay's Ring, which are both considered very bad cards in Commander. Maybe those are things that I'd be more interested in. And sure enough, what happened was I could ramp more using fewer cards. And while my early game wasn't as impactful as my opponent's, it actually worked out for my benefit. So early game, I was kind of going under the radar because I wasn't doing all the same stuff that my opponents were. And then late game, I tended to have more mana and or more cards in the hand. And so I could just do more stuff than my opponents could. And, at that point, they're also out of answers. They didn't have as many answers in their hand. So it was easier for me to do something and kind of get, run away with the game at that point. All right, let's bring this back to this idea of only 6 mana needed. How does this actually all connect? Well, I mentioned before the average CMC of my personal decks being between 3 and 4. And so if I were just playing land drops, I would need to do at least 7 land drops before I could play, on average, 2 cards in a turn. However, if we add in 1 card that needs us to ramp by 2, which is, again, how I build my ramp, put my ramp into my decks, then that means I only need to make 5 land drops. And most of these ramp spells that give you 2 are costing 4 or less. So Hedron Archive, great example of a ramp card, provides 2 mana, it costs 4 mana. But there's plenty of other great examples, and actually some that are even cheaper than 4 mana. So Worn Powerstone is a 3 mana spell, produces 2. So it's a mana rock, produces 2, but it enters tapped. So and I always like to give the example of Worn Powerstone here just as a side note, that sometimes things can be strictly worse and still be awesome. So Worn Powerstone is a strictly worse Sol Ring. It's awesome. It's a great card. So anyways, side note over. So there are plenty of things that you can do for 4 or even 3 mana that are pretty common that you can get 2 mana off of. And look at that. If you make 5 land drops and on turn 4 you played one of those things, turn 5, you've got that 7 mana. So immediately you're already at that stage where you can cast 2 or more spells in a single turn at turn 5 by using up only 1 card from your hand. And the card draw kind of plays into this to make sure that you get those 5 land drops. I also typically mulligan any hand that has fewer than 3 lands in it, and so that tends to help me as well. I only need to find 2 more lands by turn 5, so that's not as difficult. If you have about 35-ish to 40 lands in a deck, then, if you're drawing 5 cards in those first 5 turns, then, 2 of them being lands, that's pretty easy to manage. So, okay, we've talked about a couple of things here. Here's my perspective, and to answer D-Many's question, yes, I think this is a great perspective, and while I'm not really answering the question, it's more so you having to answer the question, right? So you have to look at your decks and say, what do I want to do in a turn? How do I want my turns to play out? What are 2 things I'd like to do in the same turn? And then when you look at that, all right, how much mana does that mean? And how do I get to that level of mana as quickly as possible? If, for example, you're playing a deck where you want to do play a 2-drop and then play another 2-drop, hey, all you need is 4 mana. And maybe in those decks, it would be ideal to be playing those 2 mana rocks that produce 1 mana. Maybe that works out perfectly there. But if you're like me and you're looking at your decks and you're saying, I want to do this 3 mana spell and then this 4 mana spell, or like the example that D-Many gave here, I want to play the Underworld Breach for 2 mana, then for 5 mana play the Mana Geyser, which can then let me play Devil's Play from my graveyard, and I'll flash it back. And so there's all these things you can do. And of course here, in that case, Underworld Breach isn't necessary, but let's say you've got Earthquake in the graveyard, right? Kind of a similar situation. So there's lots of things to do, and I think the only person who can answer this question is you. This goes back to an idea that I like to talk about when it comes to content creators. It doesn't matter where you go. I think it's easy for content creators to talk about, hey, this is what I do, and you should be doing it too. Again, it's easy to say that. In my perspective, hey, I do something, it's successful for me, you should give it a shot, but I don't think it's going to work for everybody. Honestly, I don't think my perspective or my approach is going to be good for every person that tries it. And the reason why is because some people just play differently. If you look at competitive Magic, which is an entirely different beast than a non-CEDH commander, you'll notice some people just do really well with a certain style of deck, right? You look at Nassif, he's playing control. There's going to be certain situations where a player gravitates towards a certain style because that style is what allows them to be successful. It's an easy transition for them to make. It's easy for them to pick it up and play that way. And so, for one person, maybe for Dana Roach, his perspective is he's going to be doing a certain type of thing, and that's going to make him successful. That's going to be totally different from how I play. And maybe for a third person, they play completely differently as well. But if you haven't tried this out, or you're playing this ramp of the variety that produces 2 or more mana, that allows you to play 2 spells in a turn by using only 1 card from your hand, right? You're using fewer resources, and you're doing it at turn 5, and so you're kind of aiming towards that mid to late game strategy of trying to impact the board most during those turns. I think that's worth giving a shot. So try it out, see if you like it, but even if you don't, what do you think about this idea of, I should look at my deck, see when I can make that value play of cast this, then cast that. And then after I'm looking at those situations or those cards in my deck that allow me to do that, how much mana do I need? And what can I do to get to that mana? So that is going to be it for episode number 1 here of the Eminence Podcast. Again, if you want to ask a question that you want to have on this podcast as well, my Patreon is patreon.com/magicalhacker. For $9 a month, you can ask a question that I'll answer in a podcast once per month. Or if you want to be at the $1 tier, first month you get to ask 1 question. And then from that point on, you'll still be supporting the show, but the topics won't be chosen necessarily by you. So thank you again to D-Many, to all my patrons at patreon.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Stay awesome, everybody.